More details about Microsoft's cheaper Xbox Series S console were just leaked. Let's talk about it. Before that, make sure to subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss another video. So first, let's talk about those specs, and this information comes from the website Tweaktown as well as senior editor over at The Verge, Tom Warren, and there will be links in the description to both of these sources, but in any case, Tom Warren posts over on his Twitter, quote, "So at Tweaktown did a great overview of the Xbox Series X and Xbox Series S specs. Here's one of the missing gaps. Winking phase. 20 CUs at 1.55 GHz. He then goes on to post an image straight from Tweaktown's website, which shows the specs of the Series X and Series S. So let's go ahead and focus in on those Series S specs, since that's the one console that we don't know for sure about yet. So starting out with the GPU power, it states in the image here that it's going to have 4 teraflops of GPU power on the Xbox Series S. And of course, the way you get that is looking back at what Tom Warren posted, 20 CUs times 64 shaders times the clock speed of 1.55 gigahertz, which, by the way, running a clock speed that low is going to make the GPU incredibly efficient. So expect this whole entire Xbox Series S machine to not draw too much power, but in any case, that gets you a total teraflop number of 3.968. Now, that's pretty close to 4, so let's go ahead and round it up to 4, and in that case, it's 1/3 the power of the Xbox Series X, so that's interesting. It looks like they'll just be targeting a lower resolution, but hopefully having many of the other specs very similar so that you get a very similar experience between the Series S and Series X minus the resolution. Now, as for the SoC technology, it says that it will be manufactured on the same 7nm enhanced SoC. For the CPU, surprisingly here it says it's going to have the same 8-core 16-thread, which I expected that, but here's where it surprised me, Zen 2 CPU at 3.8 gigahertz, and that 3.8 gigahertz is the exact same that we're seeing on the Xbox Series X. So, you know, that's kind of nice to see that they can have the same sustained clock speed, I believe, when just 8 of the 16 threads are loaded, because that means that regardless of which machine you choose, you're going to have a very, very similar experience. Now, as for the GPU, it's going to have the same advanced RDNA 2 architecture. However, the Xbox Series S is only going to have 20 compute units, whereas the Xbox Series X is going to have a total of 56 compute units. So you can see there that the GPU on the Xbox Series X is going to be much more powerful. Now, moving on to RAM, here's where things get a little more interesting. Now, the Xbox Series X has a total of 16 gigabytes of RAM. 10 of it is running at a faster speed while 6 is running at a slower speed. It looks like the Xbox Series S is only going to have the 10 gigabytes of faster speed memory. Now, we don't know for sure if it's going to have the exact same memory setup. So, for example, the Xbox Series X, I almost messed them up there, is going to have the 10 gigabytes running on a 320-bit bus at 14 gigabits per second to give you a total bandwidth of 560 gigabytes per second. We could have the same scenario over on the Xbox Series S, but my guess is they'll have the same 320-bit bus, but they'll probably be running somewhere between 8 to 12 gigabit per second memory. So let's say it's 10 gigabit per second memory because it's cheaper. That would give you a total of 400 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth, and honestly, that's more than enough considering that this machine has far less GPU power. Now, as for targeted performance, it looks like the Xbox Series S is going to target 1440p at 60 frames a second, whereas the Xbox Series X is going to have a target of 4K 60 frames per second. So I don't know if they'll always be able to hit 1440p because remember, you know, the Xbox Series X is 3 times more powerful, and 1440p is quite a bit harder to run than 1080p, so there may be some games out there that run 1080p with really high texture or lighting settings, but we'll just have to wait and see when it comes out where it typically lands. Now, as for storage, it looks like the S console is going to have a PCIe 4 SSD, but they didn't mention any details. Moving on to backwards compatibility, the S console is going to have the same setup as the X, where it's going to be able to play all Xbox One games, the 360 games, and support for original Xbox games, and of course, it's going to support next-gen games. Now, as for power, it looks like the Series X is going to draw between 250 to 300 watts, and they state that apparently the S console is going to draw a little bit more than 250 watts. They didn't specify, so who knows. And then for the disk drive, of course, this console is not going to have one because they got to make it a lot cheaper. And speaking of cheaper, let's go ahead and move on to price. And here, Tweaktown believes that it's going to be $100 cheaper than the Xbox Series X. And, you know, I think the Xbox Series X is going to be somewhere between $500 and $600, so I don't know if that's true. I've heard all sorts of different rumors ranging from $200 to $400 for the Series S. So if I was to put my money down on something and take a guess, I would guess that the Series S is going to come in at a price of $299, or essentially $300. It makes sense to me. I think $200 is just a little too cheap. They probably would be losing too much money on the console, but $400 to me sounds too expensive. I think that by cutting down on your RAM cost, by cutting down on the GPU cost, by cutting down on not having a disk drive, you can shave a lot of money off there. So if the Series X is $500, this is $300, it'll be a good entry point for a lot of people who want to experience the next gen games. And then finally, the release date. And here we know that the Xbox Series X, which stated by Microsoft, is gonna launch in holiday 2020, and Tweaktown states, quote, the Xbox Series X is due out sometime in November 2020. So if I was to guess, Xbox Series S should also launch in November 2020. Of course, they could push it back if they want to, but it seems like there's just so much rumors about this console that it's probably pretty late in development. Now, they're not going to want to talk about the Series S console because they want to talk about the fastest console because, again, all their marketing is revolving around having the fastest console this time. But I would expect it to, if it doesn't launch on the same day as the Series X, to launch very shortly after. I would really expect it to launch in the same November timeframe, but they might push it back a few weeks. Who knows? We'll just have to wait and see when it is finally announced, or if they end up scrapping this whole thing altogether. I mean, that could happen. We'll just have to wait and see. But hey, that's just what I think. What do you think about the Xbox Series S price and specs? Let me know in the comments below, and of course, I'll see you in the next video. If you made it to the end of the video, be sure to drop a like. Every time you do so, Nvidia and Intel drop prices. Also, if you want to see more, click here. You won't be disappointed.